We observed in an earlier session that one of the properties Anglophones now have in mind when they speak of poetry as a kind of literature is unusual linguistic usage. And we observed that one of the reasons we think I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud is poetry is that it does contain or display this kind of unusual usage. In the next few sessions, we will try to improve our ability to speak and write in an articulate manner about this unusual linguistic usage, which is really fundamental to ideas about what poetry and indeed literature are in Western tradition. So our linguistic usage can be unusual in many ways. We can depart from or diverge from common standard linguistic usage in many ways. But there are two very important ways of doing this. One of which is traditionally called a trope, and the other of which is traditionally called a figure or scheme. Let's begin by getting clear about the trope and establish some terms for describing it. Then in the next session, we'll use this vocabulary in connection with the Wordsworth poem. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge that this subject of unusual linguistic usage that is closely associated with the idea of literature in Western tradition, this subject is very controversial, and there has been an extraordinarily rich and lively discussion and debate about the issue over the last 2,500 years in Western tradition from the ancient Greeks on. The account I'm going to provide is grounded in reading and thinking about this debate, and I hope is at least a good basic account of how this unusual linguistic usage, which is displayed in many literary texts, how it works. So usually English-speaking people use the word lion to refer to or mean a big cat. But poets, such as the ancient Greek poet Homer, sometimes uses the word lion to refer to men, such as Achilles, who excel in hand-to-hand combat. Poets, that is, sometimes use a word which is usually used to mean or refer to one thing, to mean or refer to something else. And when they do this, we say that they are speaking or writing tropologically, or that their usage displays or constitutes a trope. Notice that in tropological usage, there need not be anything unusual about the order or sequence of words, the grammatical structure of words. What is unusual in the trope, in tropological usage, is the way words are being used to mean or refer to or to describe the world. A trope is a usage of a word to mean or refer to or describe something other than what it is usually used to mean or refer to or describe. Now, different relationships can exist between what a word is usually used to mean or refer to and what it is being used to refer to or mean. And it's essentially on grounds of these different relationships between things that we discriminate or differentiate between tropes, that we distinguish one trope from another. Now, I want to give you some examples to show you what I mean. I'll identify 6 of the main tropes and their names. And don't worry, I'll display on screen the 6 names for the 6 tropes at the end of this session. And you can also consult a document in this lesson which provides the names and definitions which we're going to cover in this session. But for the moment, I'd like you just to describe them to you and ask you to sit back and listen to this attempt to define 6 different tropes and to name the 6. Let's begin by recalling Judith Wright's poem, The Old Prison, which is about the ruins of an old prison on the east coast of Australia. You might recall that the poem begins like this: "The rows of cells are unroofed, a flute for the wind's mouth, who comes with a breath of ice from the blue caves of the south." I think there's some unusual linguistic usage in these lines. For right is using words which are usually used to describe one thing in order to refer to or describe another thing. To be more specific, she's using the word flute to refer to or describe a row of old prison cells, which no longer have any roofs. Indeed, we might even say she's implicitly saying the rows of cells are a flute. The rows of cells are unroofed, a flute for the wind's mouth. So we have a trope, a tropological description of the prison cells. But what trope is it? That depends on the relationship between the standard normal meaning or referent of the word flute and that which she is using that word to refer to, the rows of prisons. So let me ask you, what is the relationship between these two things, a flute and a row of cells which have no roofs? Is a flute a part of the prison cells? Are prison cells a part of a flute? I don't think so. So it's not a part-whole relationship. But does a flute resemble a row of prison cells which have lost their roofs? Well, a flute, like a flute, the prison cells without roofs are relatively small compartments that are open above. The prison cells make a sound when air passes over them, and the prison cells are aligned in a row as holes in a flute are. So I think it makes sense to say that the row of prison cells that have lost their roofs resembles a flute. If that is the case, then we can say that right is using a word which is usually used to refer to or mean one thing in order to refer to or mean something that resembles that thing. And the term that is traditionally used to refer to this trope is metaphor. Metaphor. Just a note before proceeding to the next trope. The term simile is traditionally used to refer to usage close, very close to that of metaphor. It's used to refer to an expression which expresses some kind of resemblance or similarity. What distinguishes simile from metaphor is that similes make explicit the assertion of resemblance by using the word like or as. So you could turn Wright's metaphor into a simile by saying the rows of prison cells are like a flute. That would be simile, but the way she has it, it's metaphor, since there is no like or as, but an assertion of resemblance is being made. Let's go to the second trope. Consider this expression: you're at sea working on a ship and the captain says, all hands on deck. By which the captain means he or she wants you and others on the ship to assemble on deck. So it is a trope, because the captain, even though it is a common expression, still, I think it qualifies as a trope because the captain is using the word hands not to refer to what is usually used, to what it is usually used to refer to, hands, part of the body, but to entire people, whole sailors. But what trope is it? Well, that depends on the relationship between the standard, more common meaning of the word, hands, and the new meaning or referent, entire sailors. What is the relationship? Does the hand of a sailor resemble the entire sailor? No. Is the hand of a sailor part of the whole sailor? Yes. In that case, we have a part-whole relationship. So we can say that in saying all hands on deck, the captain is using words which are usually used to refer to a part of a thing in order to refer to the whole of which that part is a part. And the traditional term for this trope is synecdoche. Synecdoche. Again, the spelling of that word is provided, I'll provide at the end of this session and in documents included in this lesson. Number 3, in Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, Cleopatra has a great speech in which she praises her lover Antony and says that he is or was superior to all other men. She says, in his livery walked crowns and crownettes. Now, livery is a word that's used to mean the uniform of a nobleman's servants. So she's saying, so in the uniform of a nobleman's servants walked crowns and crownettes. Now, in saying this, I think it's clear from the context and from the rest of the speech. She's saying that kings and princes wore and walked in the uniform of Antony's servants, and that they were, right, it's her way of saying that kings and princes were vastly inferior to Antony, just as Antony's servants were inferior to him. She's using the word crowns, which is usually used to refer to something kings wear, in order to refer to kings. What is the relationship between crowns and kings? Is it resemblance? Does the crown resemble the king? I don't think so. Is the crown a part of the king? I don't think so. But at least when kings are wearing them, crowns are close in space to kings. They are contiguous in space and time to kings when kings are wearing them. If we think of the relationship between crowns and kings essentially as contiguity in space or time, then we can say that the trope here is metonymy. A word which is usually used to refer to one thing is being used to refer to something which is contiguous in space or time to that thing. Now, note that this term metonymy is also used to refer to other unusual usages, such as when we say something like this, I have read all of Shakespeare, where we mean that I have read all of the plays that Shakespeare wrote. What's the relationship between Shakespeare, the man, and his works? Well, we might say the relationship is one of causation. And metonymy is often used to refer to this type of usage, where a word that's usually used to refer to the cause of a thing, namely Shakespeare, is used to refer to the effect of that cause, his works. But since Shakespeare also was close in space and time to his writing, so we could also, if we construe the relationship of contiguity very broadly, we could say that that usage also conforms with metonymy, as we just defined it in terms of the relationship of contiguity. So I think it's reasonable to say that the essential relationship in metonymy is some kind of contiguity in space or time. Number 4, Romeo and Juliet, the great scene in the middle of Romeo and Juliet, where her father tells her she must marry Paris, and he storms off stage. Juliet turns to her mother for comfort, and her mother says, no, you must marry Paris, which is something, of course, Juliet doesn't want to do, being in love with Romeo, as she is. And her mother storms off stage. She turns to the nurse for consolation. And the nurse says, well, no, I think you should marry Paris. And at that point, Juliet says, quote, well, thou hast comforted me marvelous much. Now, what is this sentence usually used to mean? Thou hast comforted me marvelous much. I think it's usually used to mean that you have given me comfort. But when Juliet says that to the nurse, what does she mean? Well, I think it's clear that she means, you have not comforted me, nurse, in telling me to marry Paris and forget about Romeo. No, you have not comforted me. What is the relationship between the two meanings of that sentence then? You have comforted me. You have not comforted me. I think the relationship is one of contrariety or opposition, in which case the name of this usage is irony. Irony is where we use words to mean the opposite of what they are usually used to mean. I think some people might use the term sarcasm to refer to this usage, but let's stay with the 2,000-year-old usage of irony as the name of this trope. Number 5. In Henry IV, Part 1, the Shakespeare play, hilarious play, wonderful history play, Falstaff and a few of his friends rob some travelers, but they are then set upon by 2 other men who rough them up and steal the money. Falstaff does not injure or kill any of them, and he just basically runs away. In recounting this incident, though, to his friends, he says that, quote, 100, unquote, men set upon him and his fellow robbers and took the money. Now, there are a few complications here, but let's just keep it simple for the moment and say that Falstaff is using a term that is usually used to refer to 10 times 10, 100. But in a sense, he's really using it to refer to 2 people, or the number 2. So we could say he's speaking tropologically. He's using a word which is usually used to refer to 100 in order to refer to 2. What's the relationship between 100 and 2? Well, inequality. More specifically, the standard meaning is greater than the new meaning. So we could use the term exaggeration for this, but the traditional term is hyperbole. Notice that in this case, the effect of the hyperbole is comical, but it need not be so. Now, number 6, the 6th and final one, which we'll cover in this session. Back to Romeo and Juliet. Mercutio, you remember Romeo's friend, gets in a fight with Tybalt, who injures him with his sword. And Benvolio, who is there on the scene, asks Mercutio if he is hurt. What art thou hurt? And Mercutio says, I, a scratch. A scratch, marry, 'tis enough. Here we have Mercutio using the word scratch to refer to what he knows is a very serious wound, one that will prove to be fatal. He dies as a result of it. What is the relationship between a scratch and a serious, fatal wound? Well, inequality. More specifically, though, this time, the standard meaning is less than the new meaning. So we could use the term understatement to refer to this usage, or the old term meiosis. So let's summarize what we have said so far then. A trope is a kind of unusual linguistic usage. It's where we are using words which are usually used to mean or refer to or describe one thing in order to mean or refer to or describe something else. And we distinguish between different tropes essentially by observing or figuring out what the relationship is between the 2 meanings, the standard normal meaning or referent and the new one. So here's a schematization of the 6 that we just identified. The word flute is usually used to refer to a musical instrument. In the right poem, it's being used to refer to rows of prisons, which resemble that instrument, and so we have metaphor. Crown, usually used to refer to headpiece worn by kings, being used by Cleopatra to refer to a king. That is contiguous in space or time to crowns, and so we have metonymy. Hands, being usually used to refer to palms and fingers, being used to hold sailors, so it's a part-whole relationship, and in that case we have a synecdoche. Juliet, saying that she has been comforted by the nurse, that would usually mean that one is comforted, but she really means the opposite of that. She is not comforted, she is really made to feel angry. So the relationship is opposition, and the trope is irony. Falstaff using 100 to refer to 2 is exaggerating in a certain way. The relationship between 100 and 2 is one of inequality, and so it's hyperbole. And then scratch, Mercutio's scratch, usually used to refer to a shallow, insignificant cut, being used by him really to refer to a deep mortal wound. Again, a relationship of inequality, but in this case, it's an understatement or meiosis. Next time, we'll see how we can use these ideas and terms in order to describe the unusual usage, which is on display in Wordsworth's poem. And we can use this vocabulary also to account for how the poem affects us and its many achievements.